This episode is brought to you by FX's The Veil, starring Elizabeth Moss. FX's The Veil is an international spy thriller that follows two women as they play a deadly game of truth and lies on the road from Istanbul to Paris and London. One woman has a secret, and the other has a mission to reveal it before thousands of lives are lost. FX's The Veil premieres April 30th, only on Hulu.
Hi, reader. I'm Cindy Burnett. Welcome to my award-winning podcast, Thoughts from a Page, which is a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network. On the show, I chat with authors whose books I have enjoyed about their new releases, and I give you a peek behind the curtain of the publishing industry with my behind-the-scenes series. With so many books coming out weekly, it can be hard to decide what to read, so I find the best ones and share them with you. If you're looking for a community of readers, bonus content, and a chance to read books before they hit the shelves, I hope you'll consider joining my Patreon group, which is filled with a wonderful bunch of book lovers. The link to join is in the show notes. Today, I am chatting with Michelle Collins Anderson about The Flower Sisters. When Pamela Klinger-Horn came on my show earlier this year, this is one of the titles she highlighted, and I knew immediately that I needed to read it. It's set in the 1920s and 1970s, both time periods that I always find completely intriguing, plus it is inspired by an actual event. Michelle grew up on a farm in the Missouri Ozarks, a place and a way of life that has shaped her writing. A graduate of the University of Missouri with an MFA from Warren Wilson College, she previously worked in advertising and public relations, taught elementary school creative writing, and was an adjunct professor at the University of Missouri and Stevens College. A mother of three, she lives with her husband in St. Louis, Missouri. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
This episode is brought to you by Bumble. So, you want to find someone you're compatible with, specifically someone who's ready for a serious connection, totally open to having kids in the future, is a tall, rock-climbing Libra, and loves rom-coms with vegan pizzas on Tuesdays just as much as you do. Bumble knows that you know exactly what's right for you. So whatever it is you're looking for, Bumble's features can help you find it. Date now on Bumble.
Welcome, Michelle. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Cindy. How are you?
I'm great as well, and I'm so glad you're here because I really enjoyed The Flower Sisters.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for reading. I'm happy to be here. It's really a pleasure, and I can't wait to talk about The Flower Sisters and let your readers in on some of the things that went on into the making of the book.
Exactly. I think people always find that so interesting to see how you started and where you ended up.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the things I have enjoyed seeing as I've been reading more about your book, getting ready for this interview, is people analogizing your stories to fanny flags. You had to love that.
I absolutely did. I wish I had thought of that myself. Yeah, I remember reading Fanny Flag many, many years ago, Fried Green Tomatoes book, and it was absolutely marvelous. And I'm very flattered that someone would consider my book to be of her ilk. She's very funny, and also the stories are very much about small towns and community, and that meant a lot to me.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the book. So first, before I dive into my questions, would you give me a quick synopsis of The Flower Sisters?
Sure. The Flower Sisters is a historical novel, so it's based on a real event that happened in my hometown of West Plains, Missouri, back in 1928. Basically, the novel starts with a prologue, 1928, that takes us into the explosion itself. And in that early prologue, we meet a lot of the characters that you will run into later in the book. And after the sort of horror of that night of the explosion and all that happened in that aftermath, the book actually fast forwards 50 years to 1978. And in 1978, one of the main characters, Rose Flowers, is visited by her granddaughter, Daisy. Actually, she's not just visited, she's dumped off at her doorstep by her mother, who's off with another boyfriend to California, and leaves her at her grandma's door for the summer. Daisy's none too happy about this, of course, and her grandma doesn't really know her. She's been estranged from her daughter, and so they don't really have a relationship, let alone she doesn't have a relationship with this 15-year-old granddaughter. Anyway, Daisy gets a summer internship at the daily paper there in the little town that I've renamed Possum Flats. And as she's doing her summer internship, she comes across a story of the dance hall explosion 50 years prior. And in the list of the dead, she sees a very familiar name and figures out that her grandma actually lost a twin sister in the blast. Of course, this makes her little cub reporter ears perk up, and she wants to do a story. She wants to be like breaking the Watergate of news in her little internship job. So she proposes doing what she calls a retrospective, interviewing people from that night that maybe were survivors or had family that they lost, and all sorts of people, so that she can tell the story coming up on the 50th anniversary of the explosion itself. Well, Daisy runs into a lot of resistance, not just from her grandma, who doesn't really want to talk about the fact of losing her sister, but from a lot of townspeople for whom the event is very traumatic. Anyway, it's very discouraging, but in the end, she gets a little help from her friend Joe, and she uncovers some of the secrets from that night. And she ends up finding out quite a bit more about not only her own family, but about the community. And it really is like no one in that town is exactly who they have seemed to be. So it's a little bit mystery, a little bit of a love story. It's a little bit quest for belonging, a coming of age. There's forgiveness, there's explosions, there's reckoning with the past. All the things that I hope will make a good story for readers.
Absolutely. And the story is loosely based or inspired by an actual event from your hometown, right? The Bond dance hall explosion?
Yes, that's right. The Bond dance hall explosion happened on April 13th, 1928. And this was a dance hall that was the second floor of a brick building in downtown West Plains, Missouri. And it was about 11 o'clock at night. The band was playing just one more song before intermission. And suddenly the whole building went up, just exploded. And the sound of that explosion and the tremors from that was heard anywhere from, close by up to 30 to 40 miles away. That's how big the explosion was. And the result of it was 39 people lost their lives that night, either that night or from their injuries shortly thereafter. And so it was quite a blow to this town of West Plains, because the town at that time was only about 3,000 people. So you can imagine, in the size of that town, everyone knew someone who had been touched by that loss or lost someone themselves. And so it was pretty devastating. And the other thing about that is just that, it was 1928. It was during Prohibition. Obviously, drinking was illegal. But in that part of the country, which is the Bible Belt, dancing was also frowned upon or discouraged in a lot of the religions there. And so there was a sort of a feeling at the time by some people that these dancers had brought this upon themselves by doing something they shouldn't. So I think that, combined with the trauma of the loss, sort of made it a story that people didn't really talk about. And so I, as a writer and a person who grew up in that town, was amazed that I had never heard of this story until about a dozen years ago. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, my grandfather, grew up in that town. He probably would have been like 9 or 10 years old when the explosion happened. And before him, I mean, my family had been there for a couple of generations. And it just seemed amazing to me that I hadn't heard this story. But then in 2012, a woman named Lynn Waterhouse, who lives in West Plains area, wrote a book called The West Plains Dance Hall Explosion. It's just a nonfiction, thin book of the account based on a lot of interviews and research that she did. And my dad mailed me that book. And when I read it, I was just astounded. So I just absolutely felt like I had to write this novel based on this event that happened in my hometown.
And the cause of the event has never been solved, right? People don't know how it happened.
Yeah, that's one of the coolest things about it. I mean, as a writer, it's wonderful when you have the open-ended ability to solve those types of things in the prose yourself. And I wasn't constrained by any reality, because of course in that time there wasn't like, CSI, whatever. They couldn't really determine how the blast had happened. There were a lot of theories at the time, everything from blowing it up for insurance money to a jilted lover setting the fire in motion to there was an auto body shop that was actually located underneath the dance hall. And some people think there might have been some sort of fumes that built up and combusted there, just like spontaneously So there were a lot of theories, but nothing concrete. So that mystery element definitely added to the intrigue for me as a writer.
A good jumping off point for you.
Definitely.
And this is your debut novel, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So how have you found that? What was the process like for you?
Well, I began writing many, many years ago. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. And I used to document our adventures when I lived on the farm outside of West Plains in a little daily family newspaper, even though there were only 5 people in the family. And you can imagine the news wasn't that interesting. But so I've always been a writer. And as I went through school, I ended up going to Mizzou, which is the University of Missouri in Columbia, and went to the journalism school there. And I would say, although my first love is fiction, I was a little more practical at that point in my life and decided I needed to be able to make a living at writing. And so I got a degree in advertising. And I spent probably 20 some years doing advertising, marketing, public relations, writing brochures, commercials, radio spots, websites, everything to promote companies and other things like that. And then when my youngest, I have 3 children, my husband and I do. When my youngest went to kindergarten, I decided to go back and get my master's in fine arts, my MFA in creative writing. So I attended Warren Wilson College just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and graduated from that program in 2013. And since then, I've just been writing short stories mostly, but I really wanted to try a longer work of fiction. And this took me a long time to do because I was writing it while my children were small. But I finally got it written. And it took me another year to find an agent. And then, of course, in the publishing business, no one tells you this, but it takes another 18 months to 2 years to actually get it published. So it's been a long road for me as a writer. But I'm so excited to finally see this wonderful story come into the world.
I do think that is a surprise for people that are not familiar with the publishing world, how long it takes once your book is actually sold to get it out into the world.
Yes. People can't believe it. And then when you tell them that you've actually sold your book, they want to be able to go order it right away.
Right. And you're like, it's going to be a little bit.
It will be just a little bit. Yes.
And I have to back up to the beginning of this story because I absolutely love that you wrote a daily family newspaper.
Yes, the Family Press. That was the name of it. And I illustrated it too, that was also not my best work looking back. But hey, it got the job done.
I hope you've saved them.
Yes, I have a few copies. I definitely do.
That is just delightful. I love that. I've never heard of that before, and I think it is wonderful. So did it take you a while to decide on the format? As you mentioned, you start out in 1928 and then you fast forward to 50 years later when Daisy arrives in town. Did it always happen that way?
That's a really good question, Cindy. I think I always knew that I wanted to set the story into a time period that was more contemporary, rather than just telling the story from 1928. I felt like it was one of those things where the ramifications of that night, I think, couldn't have been fully felt if I had just stayed in that original era. And so I really wanted to expand it and let some of those feelings and some of those relationships have a chance to develop so that maybe there would be more meaning gained from it or more perspective. And so I knew that I would have 2 timelines. Now, as far as how, who would tell this story, that did change over time because I originally had Daisy, my young narrator, the one who is the granddaughter. She was always in my mind as the narrator, but the more I told the story, the more her grandma's voice became important. And then it just was a natural as she's interviewing people to bring in other voices. And I didn't mean to end up with 6 people, but that's what happened. And so that was a real challenge, I have to be honest, because it is difficult as a writer, especially when you're writing in the first person like I did, to really create a distinct voice for each character so that they do sound different. They have their own mannerisms or ways of speaking that are unique to them. And everything from a 15-year-old to an 80-year-old, it was a challenge. And at times I was cursing myself for my choices, but I persevered.
Hey there! Did you know Baker's always gives you savings and rewards on top of our lower than low prices? And when you download the Baker's app, you'll enjoy over $500 in savings every week with digital coupons. And don't forget fuel points to help you save up to $1 per gallon at the pump. Want to save even more? With a Boost membership, you'll get double fuel points and free delivery. So shop and save big at Baker's today. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Savings may vary by state. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
Hello, and welcome to Novel Conversations, a podcast about the world's greatest stories. I'm your host, Frank Lavallo, and for each episode of Novel Conversations, I talk to 2 readers about one book. And together, we summarize the story for you. We introduce you to the characters, we tell you what happens to them, and we read from the book along the way. So if you love hearing a good story, you're in the right place. Our 9th season is coming this fall. Tune in to hear from some of the all-time great authors, Charles Dickens, Jules Verne, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and more. Subscribe to Novel Conversations wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, I think as a writer, it's probably very difficult to figure out exactly how you want to tell a story because while it seems ideal to have one person narrate, they only have their own experience. As you're progressing, you realize somebody has to impart some of these facts and Daisy wouldn't know them. So you have to bring in additional narrators.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Makes sense. Well, who was the easiest and who was the hardest to write?
That's a good question, too. I think the easiest character for me to write for some reason was Rose, even though she's, close to 80 years old, which I'm not quite there yet. Neither am I 15 years old anymore. So I found Daisy a little more challenging. I felt her heart and soul, but I also had to be real careful that I was trying to capture her age in her words. She is somewhat precocious, but I think it was a little harder writing the younger voice. And, writing men as opposed to writing women, that was a challenge too. I would say also that my preacher, Dash Emmons, was a challenge just because of the depth of his knowledge of the Bible as an Assemblies of God preacher. I really had to look up my Bible verses and make sure I was on the mark for some of that stuff. So
that makes perfect sense. What surprised you the most when you were writing this one?
I think what surprised me the most is just the way that the novel ended. So, of course, I don't want to give any spoilers, but I think as a writer, sometimes when you're writing, you have a roadmap of where you want to get to, and sometimes you're not quite sure. And I was a little bit in the middle. I knew how I sort of the event that I wanted to end the book with, but I wasn't sure about all the emotional fallout from the book. And I also wasn't sure, which character might lead us through the ending. And so I think the most surprising part for me was just that on one of my jogs, which I do almost every day, that's my best thinking time. All of a sudden, I just knew how the book was going to end. And I just could not wait to run back to my desk and write it. And it just kind of came out in one of those magical moments that writers talk about, but I never had hoped to experience myself. And when I finished it, I just was so happy, because it just seemed right. The most surprising was how it came out.
Well, that makes sense. And obviously, I don't want any spoilers either, because that is one of the fabulous things about your book is getting to the ending. Well, we've talked about what surprised you the most. Did you have a highlight of writing the book?
There were so many. I had to do a lot of research for the book just because I wasn't around in the 20s. As you can imagine, that was challenging, just trying to figure out what technologies were available, the dress, the music. I loved learning about music and dance of that time. That was a really special part of the book. I also enjoyed learning about the funeral business, which I knew nothing about. I had to do some pretty gruesome research to, I feel, adequately portray Rose, my female mortician, in the book. So that was interesting and fun. I mean, who knew that you needed spiky contact lenses to keep dead people's eyes closed? And that's a new invention. I mean, of course, there used to be, you put silver dollars on the eyelids or even sewed them closed, but the newfangled plastic eye cap is the thing from the 70s on. So,
and I learned a lot too. And how did you decide for Rose to be a mortician?
That's a great question. When I was reading Lynn Waterhouse's book, The West Plains Dance Hall Explosion, there was a female mortician in West Plains at that time. Now, unfortunately, she died in the explosion, but I loved the idea of a female-owned business, especially such an interesting, strange business like that. And at that time, it was very unusual for a woman to own her own business. So I just took a few liberties and sort of borrowed that profession for Rose, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I would also add that one of my good high school friends, that was her great-grandmother who died in that explosion. And Anne has been very supportive of the book and is excited to read it as well.
Was it something that her family spoke regularly about? Was she aware of the explosion before you started talking about it?
Yes, she and her family, that was a very big part of their family lore and memories. They definitely talked about it. Unlike my family, which was more of a peripheral family that didn't have knowledge or mention of it.
Well, I think it probably generally goes one way or the other. It is part of your family lore, something everybody knows about, has been told about so many times, or it's kept under wraps.
Exactly.
So you mentioned the music and the 1920s and how fascinating that era is. And I agree completely. But I also love the 70s, the music, the era, the clothes, the history that happened during that time period. Did you love setting a story in the 70s?
Oh, I really did. I really did. Of course, I was a kid in the 70s, so it was a lot of fun to sort of revisit some of those things, even though Daisy is a little bit older than I was at the time. The movies, Star Wars was just coming out. Of course, Watergate had just happened. Jimmy Carter was president. People were wearing groovy clothes, lots of macrame and bell bottoms and appliques on their jeans. And it was a kind of a hippie time. And in a little town like Possum Flats, that was kind of a little strange. So it was fun to have Daisy not only be an outsider, but to be able to dress this way and to have another way of setting her apart in the narrative.
I love that everybody was taken aback by her clothing. And I just recently either read an article or it was in a book I was reading, and they were talking about prior to the internet that big cities would have these clothing trends and things like that. I know what it was. It's Anne Leary's new memoir. And she was talking about when she was young and they moved a lot, and she would move from these small towns into bigger areas. And these bigger areas would be so far ahead with the trends because you didn't have the internet and people couldn't see what was happening elsewhere. And that's really gone away. And I hadn't thought about that. So I loved that you incorporated that for Daisy.
Yes, that's a lot of fun. Another thing, Cindy, I might tell you about the music, which I think is just wonderful, is that the dance hall, when it exploded, that song that was playing, that last dance number that the band played, was called At Sundown. And that music, I listened to it just, to get in the mood, I guess, to see what it was like. And it's really a neat song. And when I turned in this manuscript to my agent and then to my editor at Kensington, one of the first things that he said was, well, the song's got to go. You can't use the lyrics in the book because you don't have the rights to them. And it would be prohibitively expensive to do that, to have those lyrics. And I was crushed because I loved the song so much. There's just something about the lyrics about love is taking me home or love is calling me home. And it just really spoke to me as a wonderful message in that last song. So I wrote to Walter Donaldson's estate and explained my story about how I was writing this book about the blast and how that song was playing when the blast happened. and how I thought it would be a really neat application of the song for the estate. And the lawyer wrote me back and said, sure, just give him a credit line. So I was able to use those lyrics. And I think it just made the book that much more special.
Okay, that is a fabulous story. And I love when I hear that happening. And yes, it should open up the song to a whole new group of people.
Yes, that's what I thought. I mean, it's a shame for a song like that to be lost to later generations. It really has a lot of appeal.
Absolutely. Now I'm going to have to go listen to it. Well, tell me a little bit about the title and the cover.
The Flower Sisters title came from just actually writing the book. I had started writing this story about the explosion, and I had a main character whose name was Rose. And pretty soon she had a daughter named Violet, and after her twin sister Violet. And then she had a granddaughter named Daisy. And it just started being apparent that I had a lot of flowers going on. So the Flower Sisters actually refers to Rose and her twin sister, Violet. So those were the two main flowers, the Flower Sisters. And that's how I came up with the name. And it gave me a lot of room to talk about the characters and how different they were, because that's a big point of the novel, is that even though these women were twins, that they grew up together knowing and every thought that the other one had before they thought it, even though they were that close, they were very different people. They had different personalities. Rose was kind of shy, quiet, a little bit thorny. And then Violet was more wild and liked to be in a bunch. And I thought those characterizations of them as flowers helped me to differentiate them as people. So that was another reason I used that. As far as the cover goes, this was something that was just designed between my input. As to the era, I sent a lot of pictures and sort of moods that I was feeling about the book. One of them is the cloche hat, and the lady, it has a nice black one on with a big blue flower on it, and she's looking down, and it's kind of a mysterious, moody feeling, which I just think perfectly captures sort of the mystery and the time of the book. So that's the story of that. But Kensington came up with that artwork, and I'm really happy with it. I love it.
I love it too. It's really stunning.
Thank you.
Well, Michelle, before we wrap up, what have you read recently that you really liked?
Oh my gosh, Cindy. I have been reading my head off this year, and I tried to write down a few books that I thought were really fun. Most recently, I read The Husbands by Holly Ramazio. That was a really fun read. Just the concept of someone whose husband goes up to the attic and then comes back down as an entirely different husband. I find that concept amazing and so fun. I think it speaks to the commodification of our times that, if somebody has, bad breath or whatever, you can just send them back up to the attic and see who else comes down. And I kind of loved that idea. It was a really funny book, and it also made me think. I also read Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, and I really enjoyed that book as well. A little more serious book about a young Iranian poet who's searching for meaning. That's the whole idea of martyr, is, that your life will not be lived in vain, that you'll be remembered. And he's struggling with that as sort of a young man who has drug problems and, the main trauma of his childhood, which was that when he was in Iran as a small child, his mother was shot out of the sky in that passenger jet that was shot down by U.S. back in the 80s. So he's dealing with that trauma. But it was a wonderful book. I also read You Could Make This Place Beautiful, which is the memoir that I read most recently by Maggie Smith, and I loved it. It was beautifully written, as you can imagine, by a poet. And it's about the sort of a meditation on the end of her marriage and all of those feelings as she's feeling them. It's a very current. It's not really told with a lot of rear view mirror. It's told while she's in it. So it's very gripping and very moving and powerful. For fun, I love reading a series called Murderbot by Martha Wells. It's science fiction. My middle son got me into it a few years back, and this is the 7th book. It's called System Collapse, and it's about the main character is always this snarky sort of self-hacking robot that grudgingly loves his humans that he's taking care of on all of these interplanetary missions, and it just really makes you laugh out loud. Anyway, those are my reads for now. So on my TBR pile, I have Mercury by Amy Jo Burns and Wayward by Amelia Hart, and Northwoods by Daniel Mason. And finally, a new book just out a couple weeks ago called Discipline by Deborah Spark. And she was one of my mentors at Warren Wilson College. And I'm so grateful for her and thrilled for her that she and I have books coming out around the same time.
That is exciting. And you're a big reader. I love that when authors have so many recommendations. So thank you. And I loved The Husband so much. I read it months ago, and her interview will have aired by the time yours airs. And another one of my friends said she now teases her husband all the time when she feels like he's misbehaving. She says, "Do I have to send you up into the attic?" Which I loved.
I loved that. Yes, that was actually my very favorite part of the novel. So
yeah, it's very clever. And I think when you've been married a long time, it kind of makes you reflect on that and choice and just all of it. So I thought it was very well done.
Very well done.
So Michelle, where all are you going to be for your book tour?
Well, I'm going all over the place. I feel in the Midwest, which is, I think, a great place for this story to find its readers. I will be in Texas, a few different places that I thought I might tell you about. On Sunday, May 5th, I'll be at 7 and 1 Books in Abilene, Texas at 5 p.m. On Monday, May 6th, I'll be at Nowhere Bookshop in San Antonio, Texas with Kimberly Garza, author of The Last Karankawas. That's at 6 p.m. And on May 7th, the Tuesday, I'll be at Reverie Books in Austin, Texas at 7:30 p.m. And finally, on Thursday, May 9th, I'll be at Interrobang Bookstore in Dallas at 6 p.m. So I hope you'll let your listeners know, and maybe I'll see some of them in their seats.
I love the Nowhere Bookshop, Jenny Lawson's store. Every time I'm in San Antonio, I go there. And I really love The Last Karankawas. So that is delightful that y'all are going to be paired together.
Isn't that fun?
Yes, definitely. So that is wonderful. Well, good. And enjoy that bookstore because it is just delightful.
Thank you. I will.
Well, Michelle, thank you again. I really appreciate your taking the time to come on the Thoughts from a Page podcast.
Cindy, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been so much fun.
You know, a lot can happen in 7 minutes, and luckily, that's how long it takes me to tell a story. My name is Aaron Califato, and I'm the creator of 7-Minute Stories. I'm proud to partner with Evergreen Podcasts, and I'd like to invite you to join me on this journey. I'm going to take you on some crazy roller coaster rides using my unique extemporaneous storytelling style, and together, we're going to try to make sense of the world, all through the art of storytelling, and all in approximately 7 minutes.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I would love to connect with you on Instagram or Facebook, where you can find me at Thoughts from a Page. If you enjoy the show, please consider joining my Patreon group to access bonus content and support the podcast. If you have a moment to rate the show or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts, I would really appreciate it. It makes a big difference. And please tell all of your friends about Thoughts from a Page. Word of mouth does wonders to help the show grow. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
Don't you know that you're a grown-up?
I'm a grown-up.
Me too.
Yep, me too. But these days, being a grown-up can really suck.
Luckily, we're grown-ups who grew up in the coolest generation.
We had video arcades.
And also some of the best TV and movies ever made.
We lived the origin of awesome consumer electronics. The list goes on and on.
Yep, Generation X.
Exactly.
And we're Gen X grown-up.
Every week, the Gen X Grown Up podcast explores media, tech, toys, games, and more from both yesterday and today.
Through the eyes of Generation Xers who absolutely love that stuff. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
Or find us on our website, genxgrownup.com.
Life sucks as a grown-up.
All right, you think that was good enough?
I hope so, man. I'm tired.
Who listens to a promo on a podcast and then goes and listens to a different podcast?
Right.
I've never done it.
Right.
I'm Allison Holland, host of the Kennedy Dynasty podcast. Equipped with a microphone and a long-term fascination of the Kennedy family, I am joined by an incredible cast of experts, friends, and guests to take you on a fun, relaxed, yet informative journey through history and pop culture. From book references to fashion to philanthropy to our modern expectations of the presidency itself, you'll see that there is so much more to Kennedy than just JFK or conspiracy theories. Join me for the Kennedy Dynasty podcast.